Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast.
Welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 253 with James Nguyen. James is the co-founder and managing partner of Antihero Capital, the first investment fund exclusively dedicated to investing in blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies using evolutionary science. James previously co-founded the global app agency M5859 Apps, and he's a contributing writer at Forbes. James is somebody I would consider deeply introspective and curious, as you'll discover in today's episode. Having known James for a few years, we decided to record a podcast episode together after catching up for brunch on a relatively cold Melbourne morning. Our game plan? Talk about life. And talk about life we did, exploring a number of topics and getting into flow in our 2-hour plus conversation, breaking a previous record held by Andreas Antonopoulos. Expect to learn a number of things in today's conversation, including 1. The critical importance of finding purpose and meaning. 2. How to break out of molds of societal convention. 3. Decision-making and how to avoid paralysis analysis. And 4. Values alignment in professional and personal relationships. We'll explore that and a hell of a lot more in this 2-hour conversation with the one and only James Nguyen. Alright, well, welcome back to Future Squared. I am here in the Future Squared home studio, aka my kitchen, with the one and only James Nguyen. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. I'm really excited for this.
Oh, so am I. I think something that perhaps has been in the works for a little while now. We've known each other for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it's been a little while.
Way back when?
Circa 2012, 2013. Something.
Queen's Collective days. I think you were working with Chris Joanna at Startup Grind at the time.
Yeah, I was helping out with Startup Grind for a bit. Yeah.
Crazy days. So, I mean, many in our audience, unless they've been catching, CNBC lately, they probably may not be as familiar with you as I am. So perhaps give them the 2,000-foot view of who James Nguyen actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would lean back from identifying as anything individually, but I guess I like entrepreneurship. Yeah. I've run a couple of businesses in the past, everything from working very heavily in startups, working from a community management point of view, to actually working in startups, founding my own startups, working across industries such as entertainment in startups, in terms of actually building apps for startups, working with big brands. We've worked with BBC, Hell's Kitchen, a lot of Australian brands, Australian celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pretty heavily involved in apps for a long time. And then I worked on... From there, it dovetailed into a heavy exploration of just technology in general. So what I do now, or what most people will know me for, is my involvement in the blockchain industry. So run one of Australia's first crypto funds. So we invest exclusively in actual tokens. So for anybody who's heavily into blockchain and crypto, we do a lot in that space. So I do a lot of commentary on that space. I'm involved everything from working with actual teams, projects on it, to actually working with other investors and understanding where the space is going. So
that's Antihero Capital?
That's Antihero Capital.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We'll add Antihero Capital to the show notes for our listeners.
I appreciate the plug.
But before we get into that, entrepreneurship, startups, blockchain, cryptocurrency, everybody's talking about that. A lot of people are doing it. I guess I'm keen to understand and unpack perhaps why you got into the space in the first place, because I mean, when you were working with Chris back in the day with Startup Grind, I mean, it sounds like that was more of your sort of exploratory phase where you were just sussing out the startup ecosystem, starting to collect those dots, as I like to say, and now you're starting to connect more of them and learning a lot about yourself in the process. But was there something in particular that enamored you towards the startup ecosystem versus going down the tried and true path of, say, a corporate career? I mean, at what point and at what age did you kind of take the path less traveled, and why?
Yeah, it was pretty early on. Like, for me, the biggest thing was understanding that I want to create flow in my life, right? So flow being somewhat of a cliche term, but originally coming from...
Yes. Define flow.
Yeah. Well, flow for me originated from a book called Flow by Csikszentmihalyi. It's this idea of creating that sense of enjoyment or satisfaction or fulfillment from a moment to moment, right? So the idea of doing a particular activity and just forgetting time, right? Looking at your clock and be like, whoa, holy crap, like 4 or 5 hours have gone by. I don't know where time went.
Kind of like catching a wave, right? Where the rest of the world just falls away and you're focused in on that present moment. And I think it's the two brain waves, alpha and theta, which come together. So alpha is like this blissful, dreamlike state, and theta is this intense focus.
Absolutely.
When you combine that, it's like you're just there in the moment, catching that wave, and the rest of the world just fades away.
Absolutely. This is the perfect intersection between whether we look at it from a neurological point of view and looking at the two brain waves in that intersection, or just understanding that like the total epitome of like presence, right? Like presence, mindfulness, that gets talked a lot about in the entrepreneurial circles or just in general in terms of the self-improvement movement now. But the idea of totally forgetting everything else and being so focused, like the true definition of focus in that moment and just being obsessed, enamored by what you're doing at that present time, that for me is what flow is all about. So like I've meditated a lot about how do I recreate that sense of flow, and I think especially in the book, like one of the definitions of literally what it is this idea of tension, right? Doing something that you currently can't do but you believe you can do.
It's like 4% beyond your existing capabilities.
Exactly.
To that effect.
Exactly. So it's not too far out of the realm of possibility that you think, okay, I'm disenfranchised by the idea I can't actually reach this goal. But it's within your grasp or within your reality, if you will, which again is also subjective, but it's within your reality of what you think you can reach and think you can improve towards. And so it's that constant tension of getting there, almost getting there, failing sometimes, or almost getting there. Like the examples there are whether you're learning to surf, learning a new skill, learning a new instrument, anything like that. You practice over and over and over, because even if you can't do it at that specific time, you become so obsessed with being able to, or that belief that you're really just on the precipice of actually getting to that point of improvement that you can actually do it. For me, it's meditating, okay, how do I recreate that sense of flow in my life? And where entrepreneurship really fit in and why I moved away from a corporate life. It happened pretty early in my career. Like I was going to be an investment banker, probably an investment banker or a management consultant. The conventional path where I thought, at the time I was like, okay, well that's where you're supposed to go, right? And again, that potentially may be a little bit cliche in terms of that narrative, because a few people have a similar path to getting to entrepreneurship, but like it comes back to this idea of flow, right? Like, was I in a state of flow when I was doing those activities? Was I in a state of flow looking at a spreadsheet, running DCFs, which are discounted cash flow models for our non-IBers out there? And was I excited? Was I passionate about that stuff? And ultimately for me it was no. And so I looked to the industry at that time.
Well, before we go any further, you said, were you excited? Were you passionate about that stuff? And the answer was no. Now, I spent a good 8-9 years in the corporate world before I started to ask those questions. And I know that most people in that world who I came across have still not asked those questions and probably will never ask those questions, because there just seems to be a predisposition towards thinking that work is just something you do, it's not pleasurable, puts money in your pocket, and that's it. So, I mean, what do you think, before you even looked at the alternatives, got you to ask those questions?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I'd probably identify as being pretty introspective. right? So
have you always been introspective?
I think it comes from conditioning on how I was probably raised.
Okay.
I spent a lot of time thinking and observing, whether it's social interactions, whether it's other people. I have a lot of older figures in my life growing up, right? So I was always pushed to think about things differently. I was always, again, it's a little bit cliche to ask the question why, but I was always challenged to really understand myself. Like, why was I doing things? What was my intention behind things? Whether it was how I was raised, and that's how my parents thought at the time.
Yeah. So on that, I mean, what kind of environment did your parents create that forced you to become introspective and ask those questions of yourself?
Yeah, no. So my parents are Asian, and they come
Vietnam.
Yeah, yep. Vietnamese. My parents are Vietnamese, and so they have a very strong Eastern philosophy in terms of how I was raised, and that definitely permeated how me and my two older siblings were raised. And so, in terms of how that dovetails into introspection, whenever we did something, I always had to know why I was doing it, right? And so whether it was why we choosing a particular subject to learn at school, whether it was understanding why we wanted to go after a particular profession, like I was never boxed into any profession. And I think that, my parents were very encouraging to give me that autonomy to choose what I wanted to do. But they did always make sure that I was making a decision for myself, right? And I think I was in a pretty unique situation there, because that's not necessarily the stereotypical Asian upbringing where you do get boxed in, normally speaking, right? So they were always encouraging. They always instilled some sort of process in how I would go about things. So very, very focused on discipline, very focused on structure and consistency in terms of what I would be doing. And so those values were pretty inherent in how I was raised, but I was just pushed to think differently. Like I was never allowed, probably the wrong word, right? But I was never encouraged just to let things happen, right? And so whether I wanted to do a certain sport, whether I wanted to do a certain instrument, anything like that, there had to be some sort of reason behind that.
So it wasn't like a typical, cookie cutter tiger parent thing. Like, go learn the violin, go learn the piano, become incredible at maths, become an investment banker, climb the corporate ladder, have 2.5 kids.
No,
the definition of successful.
Yeah, which is funny that you bring it up, right? Like, so in that definition, probably not, but like there were definitely elements of my upbringing that I'm like, okay, well that aligns with the stereotype. Like I probably would say maths was my first language, right?
Yeah, but I think there is some value there is a lot of value in that whole sort of tiger parent philosophy. Not necessarily in the sense of pushing your child towards what society's conventions of success are, but a lot of the underlying sort of character traits that they're trying to instill in their children, such as discipline, hard work,
I agree.
Conscientiousness. That's basically where the value is. And now oftentimes that can be misdirected, where you want them to aspire to become a doctor, a banker, a lawyer, and unless they meet that so-called quote-unquote pinnacle, then they're not successful. But if you channel those underlying character traits into anything and just empower your child to take those character traits and apply them in a way that gets them to where they want to be, that's very empowering, because they can do that and apply it to anything. And even yourself, over the last few years, you've gone through a few sort of evolutions, pivots and whatnot in terms of the businesses that you've been exploring, but the constant throughout all of that has been that discipline and curiosity that comes with your upbringing.
Yeah, it's so funny, because one of the things I think I remember most clearly about my dad, like one of the lessons he would just drill into me from a young age, right? And funnily enough, ironically, this was when he was teaching me maths from, I think I started learning, like, Dad was teaching me from when I was like 4 or 5 or something, right? Yeah. It was just teaching me maths beyond what we would learn in school, just because that's how he was raised. But the main thing he would teach me with maths was this idea of understanding why. Like, he wouldn't allow me to just learn how to do specific problems, like whether we had like maths exercises, anything like that. Like, I couldn't just memorize exact problems and be like, oh, I've seen this before, I can just
rote learning. He
would not let me rote learn. He would absolutely not let me. And so he would always say, like, you have to understand why you're doing this, because when you get in an exam, you get in a test, when you get quizzed on it, or you have to apply these things, unless you know why you're actually applying a specific, whether it was like multiplication or division or whatever it was back in the day, whether it's applying this specific principle, if you don't understand the reason why you're doing it, you're going to get stuck when you see a problem that you haven't seen before, because it extends beyond just the superficial service level traits of, okay, I recognize this because I've seen these numbers before, right? You have to understand how to apply these things.
Yeah. So in terms of that, obviously there's a massive focus on starting with why, to quote Simon Sinek, but in terms of your early exposure to, say, mathematics, what about the actual problem-solving aspects of it? Because today, a lot of corporate executives are rolling out coding programs and front-end web development programs for their staff. Yeah. Not necessarily because they want their senior associate lawyer to start building websites, but because there is a quality of problem-solving that's required when you start building products, apps and everything of that persuasion. Would you say that, how influential was that early sort of crash course in mathematics in terms of your problem solving and the way you approach problems today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say in terms of learning first principles, whether it's mathematics, whether it's logic, whether it's like...
So first principles, what's that for our audience?
Yeah, so first principles, it's made famous recently by Elon Musk and how he likes to approach learning, but it's essentially things that don't change, right? So if you learn the first law of thermodynamics or you apply first principles from physics, there could be applications in other parts of life. Yeah. But the actual first law of thermodynamics in a lot of ways is consistent. It doesn't change from year to year. It doesn't change from month to month. Yeah. So when you lean back on things, say first principles in mathematics, for instance, is like how you approach logic is largely going to be consistent across the board, whether it's logic in terms of problem solving for maths, whether it's logic in terms of problem solving for social relationships, whether it's logic in terms of problem solving for say like a new business venture. That consistency is always going to be there. So I guess subconsciously I've always thought in those first principles, but I think in terms of that exposure from an early age, whether it's maths or being pushed to learn more than what school would just give me, is I think it comes down to my approach to learning and instilling that curiosity in me from a young age. Yeah.
And I think on first principles, so here's a little tidbit from my forthcoming book on the topic. A good way
it's
to
exclusive
look at it,
right off the press.
Exclusive, sneak peek. Good way of looking at it is if you take, say, a skateboard, a motorbike, and a bicycle, and break them down to their requisite units, right? So you might take the deck from the skateboard, the frame from the bicycle, and the throttle and engine from the motorbike, and suddenly you've got a jet ski of sorts, right? But it's about breaking things down to their smallest units and then repackaging them up into something completely different.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I like that.
So on that curiosity that this upbringing has instilled in you, bringing it back to you having that realization that actually I'm not really happy doing DCFs, discounted cash flows, looking at spreadsheets all day. I want to explore something different. So there's countless things you could have done in the world. What attracted you to, say, entrepreneurship in the first place?
Yeah, so I think for me it was going back to that idea of flow, right? So when I think about how do I create flow or how do I create that tension where I can't currently do something, but it's within my reality of I think I can do it. It comes back to understanding putting myself on a growth edge all the time, right? So a growth edge just being at your limits where right afterwards you're going to be continually pushing yourself. Like I like to think of it in the analogy of maybe like an elastic band, right? If you stretch an elastic band and you stretch it too much, then it's going to snap. But if you hold it and you stretch it and you prolong it, it's slowly going to become longer. And in the same way, I think of character or myself or my skill sets or anything like that in the same light. So why I was attracted to entrepreneurship, I think it was probably a combination of not knowing really what that meant, to be totally honest. Like at the very start, like again, it's a bit of a buzzword.
How many people really know what it means when they first get into it?
Oh man, like
and I feel like there's a lot of people who are into it for a few years who still don't quite get what it is and
absolutely
what it means.
Without a doubt, like I think so many people get attracted to the industry, obviously because it's like the new Hollywood. Like back in, say, early 2010s, it was similar to Hollywood in terms of everybody wanting to go to Silicon Valley. Everybody wanted to be a startup founder. Everybody was a quote-unquote CEO of their own company, right? When really the barrier to entry was, okay, you print a business card and tell everybody you own a company, and suddenly you can call yourself an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and that's a big thing there. I mean, I know you said that in jest, but what a lot of entrepreneurs or quote-unquote entrepreneurs do, entrepreneurs even, is spend their money and time on business cards, on the website, on some branded notepads.
Vanity metrics, right?
Vanity metrics, right? And building up their social profiles. And the whole idea of solving a need or creating something of value becomes an afterthought oftentimes.
Yeah.
Or it becomes something that they believe they're doing, but the market doesn't seem to echo those sentiments.
Yeah. So even if we drill down on that, right, like I've thought about that as well, because not only did I observe that in myself early days, and I guess that's part of the learning process, but I think it's pretty rife in our industry, and it gets thrown around a lot. So I think about like why that's the case, and I think it does come down to extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations. I think a lot of people get seduced into this world of entrepreneurship because they see the glitz and glamour, like they see the multi-billion-dollar founders, they see the social network, they see all these outcomes, right? All these rewards. And really what they're seeing there is they're seeing all the validation. And I think it speaks to why people actually end up doing things, and whether people meditate enough on their true intention, their true motivation behind things.
I mean, just to drill down into motivation and try to kind of bring together a few of the things that you've been talking about around flow, the why, and motivation. If I'm to think about Dan Pink in his book Drive, when he talks about the three intrinsic motivators: mastery, autonomy, and purpose, right? If you are getting into entrepreneurship for the first time and it's purely because you're enamored by the bright lights of movies like The Social Network, it's really devoid of purpose and the underlying why. And unless you have the underlying why, firstly, it's going to be difficult for you to even get into flow or let alone know what that is. But secondly, once the going gets tough, you're going to get going. Because, well, I don't believe in what I'm doing. I don't even understand why I'm doing it in the first place. So I'm just going to go back to doing my DCFs, right?
Exactly. So I think the analogy that's rung true for me is the comparison between junk food and real food, right? Like people eat junk food because they think it's going to quench their appetite, and they think it's going to fill them with that nutrition. It's going to be satiating, all these things. But really, it's the instant gratification of junk food tasting very good and giving you a pleasurable hit of dopamine, for a lack of from scientifically speaking, right? And so in the same way that junk food isn't as satisfying or actually as good for you as eating a nutritious meal, that you balance out your proteins, your micro and macronutrients as well. The same thing for me is like getting into entrepreneurship just for the superficial validation, right? Because you think it's going to answer all the questions, right? You think it's going to give you all that validation and give you all that fulfillment that you originally got into it for. But in the same way that after you eat junk food, a few hours later, you're going to get hungry because of the simple carbs, like spiking your glucose and then you hitting a crash afterwards. Same thing is going to happen with entrepreneurship. You're going to get hit with the same amount of dopamine hit, and you're going to be exhilarated and you're going to be enamored by the bright lights at the very start and telling everybody that you're a founder, you're an entrepreneur. But at the end of the day, when the going gets tough and inevitably building any business or doing anything hard, you're going to have to endure that pain period. It's going to happen. And so if you don't know the real reason why you're doing these things, it's going to be really hard for you to reconcile why you would even want to spend like sleepless nights, spend countless hours, spend all this period, whether it's not knowing when you're going to bring in money, whether it's not knowing whether your idea is going to work, whether it's not knowing whether you're going to find the right people for the job. Any challenge that comes up with entrepreneurship, if you don't know the real reason why you're getting into it, and if you only get into it thinking that it's going to satiate that appetite for fulfillment, then it's going to be short-lived, and you're not going to be here for the long term.
And what you've said there, I think there's parallels between a lot of life's more sort of difficult but nonetheless rewarding pursuits, such as, say, relationships. If somebody's unhappy, it's easy for them to settle or to jump into a relationship with the first person that comes along, because it may satiate that sort of need for that affection in the short term, but in the long term it's unsustainable because the reasons you got involved with that person weren't aligned to your sort of core values.
Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think it's so rife now? Because it's everywhere. Like it could be instant gratification coming from like social media, coming from how easy it is to just reach out to somebody, and then again getting that feeling of potentially being satisfied, being connected with somebody. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe it has to do with the fact that this particular generation is the first to really live on social media. And so a byproduct of that could be that other people's lives are always front of face, if you will. Yeah. It's easy to jump onto Facebook, onto Instagram, onto Snapchat, whatever the case may be, and see other people taking photos in awesome places with awesome partners and whatnot. And then if you're single, you might feel like, well, I'm missing out. I need to be doing that as well. And therefore, there is a lot more pressure on people to project a certain image online or project a certain social signal. That could have something to do with it, but I think human beings tend to default to satisfy their instant needs, and this isn't a new thing, right? This is biological evolution. This is going back to the amygdala. I feel sad right now. What's the first thing I can do to respond to this? Going back to books like Robert Sapolsky's Behave, or even Dan Kahneman, Systems 1 and 2 thinking. This is Systems 1 thinking. Yeah. Like it's just that animalistic instinct to satisfy some innate need that you've got right now.
Comes all the way back to like Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, right? And then bringing that back to say Ray Dalio's principles, first order of consequence. Yeah, so this all ties together. Dan Kahneman, Robert Sapolsky, Ray Dalio,
the whole gang, everybody.
The whole gang, everybody's at the table. Basically, it's all pushing us to do that first thing that feels good right now without really evaluating the second, third, fourth orders of consequence. So, hey, I hate my boss and therefore I'm going to quit my job. Never mind the fact that I've got no money in the bank, but I'm going to quit my job because it feels good right now. I feel empowered. I'm going to go off. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to get some business cards. I'm going to change my LinkedIn profile. I'm going to tell all my friends that I'm an entrepreneur. I feel great. A month goes by and you haven't even got a product yet. You haven't done any market testing, no validation for your idea. You haven't got any money coming in. Bills are starting to pile up. It's like, oh, maybe I didn't think this through. I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but that really happens. It may not be 1 month of runway that they jump out of the building with. It could be 6 months, but at the same time, what's the idea you're pursuing? Why are you pursuing it? Has anybody else solved it? Is it something that's going to fill you with not only freedom and autonomy, but also fulfillment and the underlying purpose? Because you could have freedom from work and you can be your own boss. You can have the autonomy to make decisions and not be accountable to someone higher up the food chain who you don't respect. But is the work you're doing fulfilling? And like I look at my own sort of evolution as an entrepreneur. When I was working on, I think when I met you, I was working on Hot Desk. And that was basically a glorified office sharing platform, or at least I was a glorified real estate agent, really, even though it was an Airbnb for office space. And I'm doing the air quotes now because you can't obviously see that on audio. But it got to a point where even though it was starting to gain traction, I mean, I had about 1,300 locations on the supply side. I was getting transactions come through the platform, making enough to maintain some sort of base level of lifestyle, but it did not fill me with fulfillment. So that purpose wasn't there.
What was the point where you realized, if you even remember the exact moment, right? Like when you realized, okay, just being an entrepreneur or just saying I'm an entrepreneur or just doing my own thing or be contrarian, right? And swim against the current, if you will, that's not enough.
Yeah.
Like what point did you realize that that didn't define your happiness? That didn't define how fulfilled you were? Because I think people conflate this idea of pleasure, which comes from instant gratification, which comes from the easy accessibility of validation, if you will, right? Because of social media, because of how, again, you guys can't see it, but I'm about to air quote, right? How connected everybody is now. What point did you differentiate in your head that pleasure that you were getting from that external validation wasn't actually what you were seeking for?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's not something that I can pinpoint immediately. I feel like it was somewhere probably about 12 months after we even established Collective Campus. And I mentioned Simon Sinek earlier, and what kind of brought it home was when our team actually got together one day and ran through this whole Find Your Why exercise. We literally went out to the Arbory at Southgate, so that's just a little bar
in Melbourne,
the Yarra River, if you're not from Melbourne. And literally spent about 4 or 5 hours there sharing stories about Collective Campus, the work we've done, what are some of our proudest moments, some of our most challenging moments. Everybody took turns writing stuff down individually on post-it notes. We'd throw it all out onto the table, so literally like 200 post-it notes of these different stories and experiences. We then group it. We're like, okay, what are the common themes and patterns here, and are we aligned on all of this stuff? And ultimately what came out of that whole process kind of reiterated what I kind of knew at the back of my mind the whole time, but hadn't articulated, was that what our purpose, as we define it today, is to unlock the latent potential of human beings to create impact and lead more fulfilling lives. And the reason why that speaks to me now is because I was a frustrated entrepreneur, or just a frustrated corporate executive for so long, working for these big organizations who have a wealth of resources and a wealth of talent, but they're just locked up in a way of doing business which is something. It dates back to the 20th century. It's archaic. It's 20th century management philosophy, right? It's all about plan voraciously. Let's have a 5-year plan. But ultimately, when the world around you is changing much faster, it's like the whole John Boyd, observe, orient, decide, act. The reason why the US Air Force overpowered the North Vietnamese Air Force 10-1 during the Vietnam War wasn't necessarily because they were better pilots, but their planes had 360-degree views versus the Russian MiGs that the North Vietnamese fighters used, which had, I think, 180-degree views. And the North Vietnamese had these semi-hydraulic throttles, which meant they had to work out, whereas the F-15s that the Americans used were fully hydraulic, so they could observe everything and they could respond much faster. And I kind of lost my train of thought for a second there.
So it was essentially like, how does that tie into what you guys found out when you guys were at the Arbory?
And so I guess the point I was trying to make is on our organizations, like they are that North Vietnamese Russian MiG fighter jet that they can't see 360 degrees. They haven't got fully hydraulic throttles, and so in order to succeed in today's business landscape, not only in today's business landscape, but to succeed as a human being in life, it's about observing, taking in new information, using that information, synthesizing it, and then making better decisions. And I just felt like I was a pawn in a much bigger game where all I had to do was play that one role. If I wanted to go diagonally, I couldn't. If I wanted to move 3 steps or more, I couldn't. If I wanted to move backwards, I couldn't. And so I found that very frustrating. And I looked around at people at Ernst & Young when I was there, at Macquarie Bank, and to me it just reeked of social indoctrination. It was like, okay. And when you'd ask people why they are here, it's like, well, I kind of fell into it. I decided to take accounting after high school. Got an accounting degree, and then it just seemed...
It's a conventional path,
It's a conventional path.
Box stickers.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier, where nobody ever really... I wouldn't say nobody, but a lot of people, not the overwhelming majority, don't ask questions as to that underlying purpose and, am I really happy or fulfilled doing this? It just becomes a matter of, well, I'm just going to keep doing this because this is what I've always done, and I'm looking around at all my colleagues and they're doing it too, and this is what society expects of me, and I'm ticking the boxes as society's conventions of success. So I just kept doing that, but then you wake up miserable, and byproduct of that is spending your weekends drinking and partying all the time, and thank God it's Friday. Why is it thank God it's Friday, and why isn't it thank God it's Monday? I love both. Like, I enjoy Friday nights, and I enjoy socializing and catching up with people on the weekend, and hitting up flotation tanks and going down to South Melbourne Market and getting the occasional hot jam donut, especially if they're fresh out of the deep fryer. But at the same time, I relish Monday mornings and the opportunity to make my little mark on the world and move the needle on these projects that we're working on. Whereas when I was in the corporate world, I hated Monday mornings. Because I knew that all it was playing a game that I didn't feel like I was making any sort of meaningful contribution to the world. And come, say, 7 p.m. that night, I would be standing on the railway station platform at, say, Parliament Station or Flinders Street Station, and just thinking to myself, what did I actually achieve or contribute today, short of playing this role?
Dude, like when you were talking about like Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, and like, I guess like the conditioned meaning around those things. This will take a philosophical turn, right? But what's your thoughts on even days of the week, right? Because this is something I'm going through in a big way, just because what I'm doing now, I have flow on a day-to-day. Like I'm so obsessed with what I do. Every day I wake up and I know exactly what I want to do, right? I know exactly I'm moving towards a certain goal. Like I have objectives that I have to tick off. But in a lot of ways, I do forget what day it is. And okay, I understand potentially I'm in a unique situation where I'm running my own business, where we live an entrepreneurial lifestyle, so we don't have to necessarily abide by the conventions of a 9 to 5 or anything like that. But what are your thoughts even on a Monday to Friday versus Saturday and Sunday? Right? Why is it not every day is a day, right? Same amount of time, 24 hours, the sun rises, the sun sets.
I mean, it's all arbitrary. And I mean, what you said there about forgetting what day it is, I mean, that is almost the definition of flow, where when you are in flow, you lose track of time. And, I've been working on this book, and when I sit down to write, it could be a 2-hour stretch. But to me, it felt like 20 minutes. And I look at the time, it's like, whoa, 2 hours have gone by. It's because I was in flow and was challenging myself and was enjoying it. And I did see purpose in the work that I was doing. But in terms of days of the week, I mean, the whole concept of a 5-day work week, it's only come about during the Industrial Revolution and all the labor relations.
That's the same relation why 9 to 5, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's arbitrary too.
Yeah, and 9 to 5 is arbitrary too. But having said that, if I look at the way our business operates, even though people have the ability to work remotely, even though I'm a big proponent of, hey, it's all about outcomes, it's not about inputs, people tend to be in the office between 9 and 5, sometimes longer, sometimes they come in earlier. Yes, we do work remotely here and there, and some of our staff have worked from overseas for extended stretches of time, and that's all well and good. But
do you think it's something we should be challenging? Because I know Basecamp, like Jason Fried from Basecamp, how they run their shop is they've experimented a lot with different work days. Like they sometimes have 4-day work weeks. Sometimes they give their employees months off.
I've thought about this. So I've actually thought about experimenting with 7-hour work days, 4 days a week, where the environment is one whereby you are doing deep work for the majority of that time, which means that, hey, we don't need to be in the office between, say, 8 and 7, which is like an 11-hour stretch where we might be in deep work for, say, 5 of those hours and then shallow work for the rest of it. I'm like, hey, if you guys can come in 7 hours a day, 4 days a week, just deep
crush
work.
it, and that's it, yeah.
But we're human beings as well. And I struggle to see how... will we just adjust then and come in and do like 4 hours of deep work and then 3 hours of shallow work? Just like when people have a long weekend and then they end up...
What, like Parkinson's law, right?
Parkinson's law, right? Yeah. So if you have more time, it'll take you long to do it. If you have less time, take it less time. But then do you lose out on the human element of building a business? Because to me, business is... the money-making aspect is an aspect of it. A big part of it is personal development, relationship development, working towards a common mission. It's the pursuit. If you take that out of it, is it sustainable in the long term? Because I feel like when it comes to building a team, for me, I've been able to attract high caliber people who, I can see that I am paying below market rates because I'm able to empower them with a worthwhile mission. There is values alignment, and there are, extrinsic incentives that will come into effect later, such as equity and everything else. But if I did not have an environment where we had a bit of fun and we did make space for shallow work, we will not build the types of relationships that would make coming into work fun. So I think there is a distinction between flow and fun, where you can get into flow, get into deep work, really enjoy your work. But at the same time, I think you need to carve out space for fun and relationship development amongst the team. And therefore, when you have those two elements, that sustainability, where people are going to keep bringing their best for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, however long it requires you to achieve your mission or to accomplish your mission, becomes a lot more attainable. So I am all up for experimenting, but if there is a better way, and the Basecamp way may be it. I mean, I know Matt Mullenweg from Automatic, his entire team is distributed, and I think something like, 60% or 70% of the world's websites run on WordPress and Automatic's CMS. So I would love to explore a new way of doing things. At the same time, will it shake the tree too much?
What I like from what you just said, and it resonates with...
Just one thing? Man, I said like 20 things there.
Just the one thing I took from that. No, like...
Should have just stopped me after that one.
Yeah, I should have just jumped right in. No, it was at the end, right? Like you were talking about, essentially, you were talking about flow being different from fun, right? But it's around congruence, right? And I think that's really important. Whether you're building a team, whether you're building a life, right? Like understanding that congruence is so important across all aspects of your life, and it's also with your team. Like you don't want them to feel disjointed. Like you don't want a disconnect between what they view as fun and what they view as work. Like you want them to be able to form this sort of like camaraderie with your entire team, right? Like in essence, we build intimate teams, we build businesses, at least how you and I kind of see the world and see this professional aspect, is we want to build a family. We want to build a lifestyle around this, right? Like it's not work and life, it's work-life integration.
You want to build a family to a certain degree.
Okay.
You know where I'm going with this, the whole Reed Hastings Netflix culture deck, where a sports team, not a family, is what Netflix says. Whereas a family is all about unconditional love.
See, that's interesting though, right? Because Ray Dalio talks about, in Principles, he talks about if he hired his son, he would fire his son because it's the best thing for his son, right? And like that's how he treats his family. And so it's like I agree, like again, it potentially could be subjective to like family values and definition of family values, but it's like how I see it is this idea of just being in the trenches with each other and doing what's best for everybody in that group, right? Whether we define it as a family or a sports team or whatever it might be, it's like we have an aligned goal here, right? Our aligned interests extend beyond just necessarily like the commercial success of the business. It's also the professional and personal maximization of our potential, right? So I'm assuming, right, like what you were getting to with the whole sports team Netflix analogy there was like if somebody's out of line or somebody's not meeting the standards, like they have to be called out for it. But like how, and again, I guess this comes back to congruence, is like how I want to live my life across all my relationships, whether it's with my family, whether it's with my friends, whether it's my co-workers, right? Like I want, again, not to overquote Ray Dalio, is a great man, but like it's the radical transparency. It's like that's the foundation of the relationships I want to build. I want that transparency. I want that honesty. I want that accountability. Like they're the sorts of relationships I want to build. So even with my team, right, like in our company, that's the level of interaction that we want. We want to be pushing each other to be better all the time. And I guess where that comes back to whole like fun versus flow and how you balance those things it's something I think about as well. And again, I think it's this idea of we don't necessarily know the answer yet, and we're all experimenting. And I guess all throughout life, like the more we know we don't know, and like we're always going to be constantly experimenting. But something I'm reconciling in my head is this idea of balancing work versus play, or is it really around the integration of both, right? Like it's not to say that you can't spend time with people you work with, and whether it's play table tennis or you go out or whatever it might be, go-karting, whatever you guys choose to do as a bonding activity.
We went archery attack a couple of weeks ago with the team. It was great.
How did that go?
Down at Parkville Gardens. Basically shot my co-founder Sean in the head with a rubber arrow. Although
I was about to say I'm glad you caveated that with a rubber arrow, because in my head I'm archery. I'm like, you tell me now you just shot Sean in the head with an arrow?
Yeah, well, he did get me back, so Sean, just in case he's listening, didn't want our audience to think it was a one-sided battle, but no, that was a lot of fun. But I think there's something to be said there about integration, not only about let's head out and go to virtual reality, zero latency and things of that sort, but integrating work and play. For example, we've got I offer my team Vagabond Flex Sleeve, which basically means up to
I like
4 weeks a year. You can basically work from anywhere in the world, but there are a couple of caveats. One, it's got to be a place you've never been to before, and two, you've got to go by yourself.
Oh.
So the reason...
What was the team's response to that when they heard the rules?
I only introduced this about a month ago,
Yeah.
but the team's response has been positive,
Yeah.
especially some of the, say, sub 28-year-olds in the team. But the reason why I introduced this wasn't just so, hey, we've already got a flexible sort of working arrangement, but this was more about, hey, I want you to go somewhere you've never been on your own, so you get out of your comfort zone. It's going to force you to have to get out there, speak to people you don't normally speak to, build new relationships, because, hey, you're going to get bored after a couple of days of hanging out on your own. Getting out there, getting out of that comfort zone is going to force them to not only learn stuff about the world, but learn stuff about themselves and what they're actually capable of. Which is one of just going off on a slight tangent. One of the reasons why things like, say, Spartan races are so popular is because they force people to do something they never thought was possible. It's like, wow, you just did 14 kilometers in the mud and...
Well, dude, that's what I like about like Growth Edge, right?
Yeah.
Like, doing something like totally uncharted territory, at least from a personal perspective, whether that's why I got into entrepreneurship or why anybody does an activity like a Spartan race or anything like that. It's literally pushing the boundaries of what you already think is possible, and then being in that no man's land, right? And then learning everything about yourself.
Yeah. But that whole work-life integration, I mean, I've been on so many business trips over the past, like yourself, couple of years to Singapore and the US and London and whatnot. But that I see as an integration of work and play, because I go there, I do my work, but at the same time, I'll be in Greenwich, New York, and I'll head over to the Comedy Cellar on a Wednesday night and see someone like Ari Shafir perform and meet a bunch of people from NYU, which is just around the corner, and have a chat about AI and the existential risks it poses. And it's like, for me, this is just the perfect sort of coming together of work and play, rather than there being sort of a clear delineation. Because I think that's what we've got at the moment. It's like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday work, Saturday, Sunday play. Well, why not?
Have
that's
both
not
at the same
integration.
time.
You can have both at the same time.
Yeah, not mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah, but then again, well, not again, but something new I want to introduce is this a privileged position? Like, is this something that we can do because we put in the work to create these businesses that are sustainable, are cash flow positive, we can therefore make these decisions? But a lot of people don't have that authority, or you might be a senior executive at a large company, but that doesn't mean you can change things. You've got to deal with so many other personalities, many of which, if not most of which, have come through this archaic sort of way of doing business that we've already discussed. How do you then go about changing that? I mean, this is probably out of the scope of this particular conversation, but that's probably what people are struggling with, because they might be listening to us like, all well and good for you guys to say, but our reality is that we're incentivized based on these 9 to 5 hour work days. Our bonuses, our salary increments are all based on showing up between those hours. We can't just start integrating work and play and bailing for 3 hours in the middle of the day to go and play archery, right? So I guess I'm just conscious that some people listening to this may get turned off by it and think that, well, how do we apply that? So, I mean, what do you think people could do in that space to start integrating it in their own lives if they are in an organization where perhaps they haven't got as much freedom as we might?
Is the option of quitting their job and pursuing this lifestyle out of it, or is it just like, okay, within their...
It's an option. Anything is an option. It's all on the table. So, and that's the thing, right? So one thing that I will just jump to real quick is, with my work with a lot of corporate innovation executives, oftentimes they get frustrated about getting buy-in, and I'll present them with about 22 different sort of techniques that they can employ to get that buy-in. And I basically say, look, try these things. If none of them work, if everybody... Because you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make a drink. Yeah. And so if you try all these things and you still can't change people's way of thinking, then perhaps you want to leave, quit, because you don't want to work for an organization where you can't be your best, where your talents aren't being realized. And so what you've just asked there is quitting on the table, definitely.
Yeah.
But what if there are
not ready for it, right?
They're not ready for it mentally, or maybe they've got a lot of financial obligations, they've got 2-3 mouths to feed, and therefore making that decision isn't as clear cut as it would be for someone without those commitments.
Yeah, I think this probably comes back to, or at least how I'm going to answer this comes back to how I'm programmed, right? Like I said before, like I'm pretty introspective. So my answer to most things is like I don't like that a lot of times people say, oh, figure out your why, or figure out internally what's your motivation, stuff like that. Because when I was in the stage where I was trying to figure it out, like that was never accessible for me. That was never practically useful when somebody just said, oh, figure out your why. But how I approach situations like that, and I imagine myself, okay, if I was still in a corporate job, and a lot of my friends are still working the more conventional 9-to-5, a lot of people that are very close to me still work that, and I talk to them about, I guess, the distinction here. I talk to them about, okay, the sort of life that you can live that's fulfilled, a sort of life that you can live that extends beyond just ticking the box, living in that and pursuing that hamster wheel life. And I have to be conscious that there are nuances to everybody's situation, right? Mm-hmm. As you said before, some people aren't necessarily going to have the same sort of freedom, whether it's financial freedom, whether it's time freedom, anything like that, to just say, okay, let's just quit our job, throw caution to the wind, and just ignore any potential existing responsibilities that we have to pursue this. So that's something that I do have, I straddle in between, trying to give an authentic answer which comes from a place that reflects my own reference experience, but also trying to be empathetic of where they come from. But I think there's probably two main things I think about. It's number one, it's like just having very, very clear clarity around where you are, right? Like if you understand that you're living a 9-to-5 or you're in a job right now that potentially may be unfulfilling, or you may feel disenfranchised by, but you're doing it because it is a vehicle for you to fulfill certain responsibilities, right? Like if you're a parent and you have children, or if you're a sole income earner and you have to provide for other people, right? Like I think it would be negligent just to say, okay, well, I'm just going to throw caution to the wind, whatever it might be, and I'm only just going to focus on myself. And I think that selflessness comes into play when there are other people that are counting on you, right? And so I think you have to consider those things. And when you're in a situation like that, it's meditating on the idea of, okay, seriously, why am I doing things? And this is what I mean by the layers of texture to the question of why, right? It's not just why am I doing things because I'm passionate about this, or why am I doing things because I thought I was always going to be an astronaut, or whatever that calling was supposed to be. For me, it's around, okay, why am I doing this? Is it a vehicle for me to feed my family? Is it a vehicle for me to get a certain amount of capital right now, because this is a path well trodden already, and I know I can get a consistent amount of income that I can save up to start a business later. But it's just understanding really why you're doing it, right? Like, and it's being very, very honest with yourself. And I think that's what's really hard for a lot of people. I think when they nail down and understand the real reason for why they're doing things, sometimes the reason is they're scared. They're scared of going into an uncertain territory. They're scared of living in a world where they don't know when their next income is going to come from. They're scared of having their ego bruised by pursuing a new profession, or pursuing a new skill set, or trying to learn a new skill set they have no idea how to even start with, right? And I think it's nailing down exactly what is the reason, because the reason why you do something is not always good, right? And so I think that's also a distinction that gets understated. It's like people say, oh, find your why. It's like, okay, that's the one side where you find your good why you want to be doing something, but it's also find your why you're doing it. Could be that, okay, you're not quite the person that you want to be yet, or you're not quite the person that aligns with the person that you say you will, right?
Yeah. So there's two whys that we should perhaps call out here. So one is the why that underpins what you actually do. So for example, if you're, say, Brian Chesky at Airbnb, you want to help people have authentic travel experiences and connect people. That's your underlying why. But his why for starting that business in the first place could be because he wanted the opportunity to meet his creative potential, or he wanted that fulfillment and the freedom from whatever he was doing previously, right? There is that why, as in, why do you want to do this thing in the first place? But then what is the why underpinning that? So I guess on people who perhaps haven't got that freedom to do whatever they want to do right now, I say that loosely because you can always do something to start moving the needle. And like you said, it's much easier to make excuses and say, well, I can't right now because I've got a mortgage. I can't right now because I'm saving up for this vacation in a few months' time, and I'm not going to be able to take leave. I can't right now because I've got to put the kids through private school. I can't. But changing that question to how might I start moving the needle on these things, and that I mentioned the observe, orient, decide, act loop earlier, but I think so there's something to be said about positive feedback loops of all persuasions, and it kind of ties into what you're talking about with flow. It's challenging, but there is enough positive feedback there to keep you moving forward. And we were joking earlier off air about me playing chess with my nephew the other day, and how when I play sport with my nephews, I don't let them win, but I let them come close to the point where they're getting a little bit better each time. They can taste victory, but
you take it under their nose.
I snatch victory from the jaws of defeat at the last moment. But it keeps them wanting to play. Yeah, it keeps them wanting to keep playing. So perhaps there are small things that people can do in those instances to start moving the needle and demonstrating that, hey, maybe I can do this. And I look at my situation, I look at the situation of other corporate executives turned entrepreneurs where they started doing things on the side, slowly but surely, over the course of a few months, if not course of a year or two. But knowing that you've got that other thing there that you are working on, suddenly it makes that miserable monotony, I like to call it miserably comfortable, a miserable comfort that comes from your day job, less miserable, because it's like it's not the be all end all, and you do see this other pathway presenting itself. Like there is light at the end of that very distant. There is a distant light at the end of that tunnel versus just this in front of me and nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think if people in that situation where they're looking for that exposure potentially to the other side to see if it's right for them, I think aggressive experimentation or aggressive tinkering, as Nassim Taleb calls it, is so important. Because I think one of the biggest points of blockage for a lot of people in say like a corporate job, right, or a conventional lifestyle, moving over to a contrarian lifestyle, right, is uncertainty. And again, there's layers to that uncertainty. It could be financial uncertainty, it could be existential uncertainty, it could be psychological uncertainty. Like we're inclined to lean back from things that we don't know. Right, come from a biological perspective. We don't know what's on the other side. If it's harmful, it's going to threaten our own existence, and I think that does play out in terms of the motivations why people are hesitant to move from that job. And so, really, the antidote to that is getting reference experience to give you confidence and of knowing what's on the other side, right? And I think what you said there of people doing side hustles or people doing like small things outside their job, like. Absolutely, there is always gaps of time. Everybody has, right? And I understand it's a sliding scale. Potentially we have a little bit more freedom and autonomy with where we can invest our time, but somebody in a 9-to-5 job potentially only has time outside those 9-to-5 and weekends, right? But it's all around priorities. So if your priority really is you want to get out of that existential angst when you're feeling disconnected or you're feeling detached from your life's purpose or what you're doing right now, then it's about prioritizing that. And then in terms of practical steps, what you would actually do when you prioritize that is you have to actively tinker. Like I kind of, and this is applicable to a lot of things in life, whether it's relationships, whether it's business, whether it's skills, anything you want to be spending your time with, is understanding that life's kind of like a buffet. Like we were talking about this off air, but it's a lot of the times we make decisions based on a siloed reality, right? Like only the amount of available information we have at our disposal influences our decision at that time. So in the same way, if you take that analogy of a buffet, potentially if you've only started your life only eating one cuisine, whether you just eat Japanese all your life, right? And that's all you really know. And you don't know whether you like these other cuisines or not because you've never tried them, right? But if you get comfortable with only Japanese and you've been hardwired or you've been conditioned, which is really what all of this is at the end of the day. People who live the conventional 9-to-5 have been conditioned. This is the only path, right? Like if you've been conditioned that Japanese food is the only food that you should be eating, and you, to some extent, have some sort of stigma or some sort of conditioning around the other cuisines not being appetizing or potentially may make you sick or anything like that. Like again, I chose Japanese arbitrarily. It could be any cuisine. Then you're going to be inclined to stay within the lane of comfort, right? You're only going to eat Japanese food. So what you have to do is you have to aggressively tinker. You have to taste the other cuisines. Like, you don't know if you like Moroccan food. You don't know if you like French food. But it's not saying that you definitely will, but you won't know your taste preferences. You won't know what potentially resonates with you unless you try a whole lot of different things.
Yeah.
And so, again, to use that food analogy, maybe for those people who are in that situation, maybe it's all around just tasting appetizers, right? Small appetizers from different cuisines, because you might taste French and you might think, okay, French is not for me. Or you might have Australian food and say, okay, that is definitely for me. But you're not going to know that. And it's also, that's important that we stress this as the process and not just giving people a prescriptive solution to say, okay, go out and eat French food, because that's the solution, right? Because tastes are subjective. So it's really around go out and taste different things, and how that then relates to business or entrepreneurship or just a life calling is like, a lot of people, at least from my own reference experience, is like a lot of people I talk to, a lot of people that I guess ask questions like this to me.
Yeah.
They talk to me about like, okay, well, I don't know what I want to do yet. Like, I've been working in an investment bank. I've been working in a consulting firm or whatever it is.
They haven't collected enough dots.
That's it. And again, we were talking about this before in terms of like artificial intelligence, right? There's not enough data points.
Yeah.
They don't have enough reference experience to make an informed decision for themselves. And so for me, when I'm talking to these people and a lot of close friends and family and all these people in similar situations, I tell them it's around aggressive tinkering, because I can't tell you go out and pursue, say, a tech lifestyle, or go out and pursue blockchain or crypto or anything like that. Like,
it's probably a reason why I think there's a correlation between what you're talking about here and the reason why most first-time entrepreneurs build an app or a two-sided marketplace.
Lowest hanging fruit.
Lowest hanging fruit, but that's also comes back to the data points that they've collected. That's all they really know about entrepreneurship, because that's front of mind. That's what's glorified on Mashable and TechCrunch and everything else. But there's so much more to it that they could be exploring, but that's all they know. They're like, oh, we need an app. Let's build an app for dog walking or whatever the case may be. And then it doesn't work out. It's like, well, what else could you have possibly done? Let's peel back a couple of those sheets and see what else is on offer. But not clicking those dots means that you just can't connect them moving forward, right? The whole Steve Jobs thing. Like, if are you familiar with the Medici effect?
No.
Right, so during the Renaissance, the Medici family brought together sculptors, philosophers, painters, architects, and whatnot in Italy, I believe it was, if not France, one or the other. But basically, it triggered this artistic, creative explosion, which made way for the Renaissance. Now, if you're collecting lots of different dots across disparate areas, like you said, it's a buffet. Try this, try that. It's maybe not even a matter of sticking with one of those things and just exploiting one of these once you've explored everything, but maybe connecting the dots and taking the Japanese and maybe building some kind of a fusion dish, right? But that's where entrepreneurship and creativity actually happens. It's at the intersection of these different sort of experiences and dots, rather than just doubling down on one thing that's been done before, because that's not really entrepreneurship or innovation. Then you're not really doing anything new in the world. You're just copying what's come before you. But you can't connect the dots unless you've actually collected them to begin with. Now, having said that, are people, I'm not going to, that's a bit of a blanket statement, but there is a risk there that you spend all your time exploring and basically don't exploit anything, and also get paralysis analysis, which can apply outside of business, but it can also apply when it comes to relationships. Not speaking from experience, of course. And that then does present challenges, because hey, you've got so many data points, and it's difficult, even for AI, it's difficult to determine what is the best possible outcome, because it's all based on how you choose to interpret these data points. What variables are you using to evaluate data point X over data point Y, and which one is more aligned with your goals and where you want to get to? So once you've collected the data, once you've gone to the buffet, you've tried everything on that menu, how might you then start making decisions that align with where you actually want to go? How might you crunch that data?
Yeah, this is something I was thinking about recently, actually, right? Yeah. And so it actually does apply to relationships, and does apply to choosing your path and everything like that. But I was speaking to somebody around distinguishing the difference between, at the time, was about like falling in love versus potentially just being comfortable with somebody, right? And then preferencing the former. Like from my personal perspective, like I preference the former, like that. When having fallen in love before, then understanding what it's like to be with somebody who you're not in love with. Like I have that reference, right? But I wouldn't have that reference unless I had been in a relationship with different people to understand what that felt like, right? And I think the same thing actually applies to flow, which comes back to what my purpose or what I prioritize in life is. Like once you're in a feeling of flow, you understand what not being in flow feels like, right? So in the same way you fall in love, like I thought about it in terms of like falling in flow, right? Like you can fall in flow with an activity. And so that's why I'm such a big proponent for aggressive experimentation, because when you have all those data points, when you've tasted all those foods, like you don't need to necessarily articulate. Sometimes it's helpful if you're trying to communicate the message to somebody else, but you don't need to necessarily articulate why you like Japanese food over French food.
Yeah.
You just need to know you like eating Japanese food more than French food, right? So you don't necessarily need to articulate the feeling of liking a specific activity or not liking a specific activity. Like we like doing these things. Like we both write, like we like speaking about these things together and having conversations around that. So articulation is important for us, but for other people, potentially other listeners right now who are thinking, oh, I might be in that situation, but how do I then synthesize all this information to make the right call? I think it's leaning back on this idea of sometimes you actually know. And I'm generally hesitant to be so reductive and simplify things to say, oh, just sometimes you know, or just trust your intuition or anything like that. My mind's reasonably scientifically inclined. Like I like knowing the actual biology and the reasons behind why that's the case. But sometimes for listeners that don't necessarily resonate with that way of thinking, it's enough to say, okay, I know when I like doing an activity and I know when I don't like doing an activity. Like I know when it's a chore and I just have to slog something out for 5 hours versus I can do something where 5 hours goes like that and just zips by. Yeah. And I think that distinction is actually quite important. That experimentation actually leads us to a point of reference experience. And that's ultimately for me the goal, the reference experience, so I can compare the two. So I can say, okay, I have worked, say, potentially in media versus I've worked in, say, crypto. And I know when I'm in crypto, I'm in a state of flow and I'm enamored by what I'm doing on a daily basis. And I lose track of time versus when I'm in, say, a different job, I don't necessarily like that. Or when I was in IB or anything like that, like time moves slowly. Like I don't necessarily have to articulate that feeling to understand that those feelings are different.
So one thing I want to pull out of that is the fact that, hey, you might have all these data points. Now you just know that you prefer Japanese food over French food. Now in other cases, people might like Japanese food and they might like the Brazilian barbecue and they might like Italian and Vietnamese and they like them all and they can't choose between them. Or when I go out to a Thai restaurant, I like the papaya salad. I also like the Thai beef salad and the pad Thai and the chicken skewers and the satay sticks and everything else, right? It's like, I only want to buy a couple of things. Like, I'm not going to eat all of this stuff. So even though you might like a lot of different things, it can still, to a certain degree, be paralyzing for people. But having said that, Jeff Bezos is a big proponent of the 70% rule, where even if you don't have all the information, it's like make a decision with 70% of the information and just back yourself. Otherwise, you're just not going to do it, and you're going to wait too long. So whether this applies to business, you're just going to sit around and wait for the opportunity to present itself, but it never does. Whether it applies to, say, property investment, you're going to sit around and wait for the market to bounce back and become more affordable, but it never does. It just becomes more expensive. Or it could be relationships. You're going to sit around and wait for the right person to come along. But that, whatever that means, but you wake up one day and you're 45 and you're still waiting. So there is something to be said about making the decision, even though there are other options on the table that also look appetizing, but backing yourself. And you mentioned love and being in love with the person, but that oftentimes is just a chemical reaction that we have, and it's short term. It's like happiness. Happiness is not a sustainable state. It's a fleeting moment. Meaning, purpose, that is a sustainable state. And just as I was thinking through that, it prompted my thinking around, we mentioned Robert Greene's new book, 33 Strategies of War, off air before. And one of the lines I've highlighted in my book notes was, do not lose your presence of mind. The reason people think things through carefully is that they are terrified of making a mistake and of what that might mean for them. But when they are tested in battle, they cannot make a decision. They see problems everywhere and defeat in the smallest setback. They hang back not out of patience but out of fear. Often these moments of hesitation spell their doom. So there's, that aligns perfectly with what Jeff Bezos says. It's about backing your decision and, love being more than just a noun, more than just a chemical reaction feeling, more than just a fleeting moment, but a verb and something that you do. And that feeling then becomes a byproduct of the action. Kind of like what Robert Sapolsky talks about in Behave, when he talks about human behavior and what is it reflective of. He says that, genetics can inform, biology informs culture, which informs biology. It's like this feedback loop. So if you behave a certain way, it can inform the way you feel, which informs the way you behave. Whether that applies in relationships or whether it applies with that choice you've made. Because if you think about what you're doing now, what I'm doing now, there were other things I could have done and potentially would have been just as, if not maybe more happy doing them. But because I have committed to this, at least for the foreseeable future, my actions reflect that, and those actions then feed that commitment.
Yep. Like, there's a couple things there, right? Like, I think the first caveat to note is when we make a decision, we're also predisposed to rationalize that we've made the right decision, right? It's cognitive dissonance. We want that consistency in our own identity. Like, we made the right decision.
Life would be pretty difficult if we weren't able to rationalize.
We're walking around always having an existential crisis. But like, I agree with you, actually. Like, Jeff Bezos's idea of the 70% rule and just like going in and making a call, I think analysis paralysis puts a lot of people in a bad situation, mainly because they don't make a decision. I think you've made a really, really good point in terms of adapting that analogy. It's like, okay, what if you want more than Japanese? Like, what if you want all these other things? And I think a thought experiment that I think is worthwhile for people to think about or conceptualize is appreciating and acknowledging that time is finite, right? That if we don't make a decision, then we will pay the consequences. So the idea there is, like, when you create these false parameters and you force people to make a decision, they're going to be inclined to follow not necessarily a calling, but follow something more intrinsic if they know there are repercussions for them not making that decision. And I think a lot of people get lulled into this sense of comfort because they don't necessarily think about time being finite, right? Like, not a lot of people appreciate this idea, or maybe they do appreciate it, but they're not always cognizant of it, that all we have really is time, right?
So just wanted to jump in there, and off air we mentioned Annie Duke, who wrote Thinking in Bets, former World Series of Poker champion, and she puts forward the case, it's kind of like a thought experiment, if you will, but that if you do nothing, that is a choice. And usually when people are weighing up their options, they don't consider the option of doing nothing, which is what they do when they don't make a choice. Now, if that was on the buffet, like you had Japanese, you had Chinese, and then you had an empty tray, you're not going to pick that empty tray, but that's oftentimes what people do, because it's like, I can't choose, so I'm just going to not make a decision.
Exactly. No, well, it's a paradox of choice as well, right? Like, which is is a cognitive bias. It's like when there's more choices on the table, it's opportunity cost, right? Like, if we only had two choices, right? If we only had Japanese or Brazilian food or whatever it is, then we only have one option that we said no to. But if we have 20 different options, now we're running in our mind, did we make the right decision? And I guess a way that I've used to narrow my focus to essentially reduce the number of options I have, to I guess reconcile in my head the decision I'm making, is understanding that, imagine you have a timer, right? If you don't choose a cuisine within those 60 seconds, you don't eat. Right? And so there is now a consequence, and it's the same as what you were just saying with Annie Duke. It's this idea of showing them that they're making a choice, or there's repercussions of choosing nothing, right? Like, you're so hungry and you can't decide, well, you're going to get nothing. In the same way, if you're trying to decide between two business options and you're saying, I'm going back and forth, well, you could half bake both of them and do none of them, right? Like, you potentially would make no money from either of them, and you're not actually able to materialize either of them. And then for me, it's been understanding that, there are repercussions to that. And again, it comes back to being slightly more introspective around my identity. But I think about this idea of, would I rather do something and fail, or would I rather do nothing at all, right? And potentially people may think, okay, well, it's safer, you feel more comfortable if you can have an excuse to say, well, I didn't try, so I didn't necessarily.
It's a very teenage way of looking at the world. I didn't try on that exam, so I don't care.
Yeah, it's like it's grappling with our own ego, right? Like we're protecting our ego by not acting at all, right? But like when we understand that if we don't make a decision between two things, there is an opportunity cost of that, and that opportunity cost could be like existentially very painful, right? Could be economically very painful, or it literally just could be a waste of our time. And as soon as we start to understand those things, and this is what I mean by like thinking about our thinking and being very meta with the whole process. And again, this is how my brain's inclined and just how I think about things. But as soon as I understand that, I'm like, well, that terrifies me.
Yeah.
That freaking terrifies me that I could have none of those options. And again, it could be with relationships as well. If you're trying to decide whether you want to be in a relationship with somebody or not, as soon as you understand that there is a consequence for not making a decision at all, that potentially could thrust you and give you the motivation to be like, okay, I need to be catalyzed into action here, right? And it's just getting closure. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to date that person. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that business. You have to make a decision, because if you're not making a decision, you're wasting time. And Bruce Lee talks about this dichotomy between how time is used. You either spend time or you waste time. Spend time is when you're being intentional with how you actually use your time. Waste time is when you let life happen to you. Yeah. And it's definitely how I think, and it aligns with what we've definitely talked about.
It's interesting what you said there about you've only got X amount of time to make a decision, whether it's Chinese or Japanese. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with Brian Christian, who wrote the book Algorithms to Live By.
Yeah.
And he's got this theory.
That's a good book.
His 37% theory, optimal stopping.
Yeah.
Where, say you're looking for a parking space at a big shopping mall, and you come past the space, but it's not quite close enough to the door, so you just keep going.
Yeah.
But if you've given yourself, say, 20 minutes to find the space, 37% of 20 minutes. So we're looking at about 8 minutes or so.
Yeah.
After 8 minutes, the next space you find, if it's better than what you found before or as good, take it.
Definitely.
Because you're not going to find better. Or very low likelihood of finding better. And you need to apply this to apartment shopping.
When you were hiring applicants,
looking for applicants, because we can always think, maybe if we just keep looking, it will be better. Maybe if we just wait a little bit longer, a better opportunity will present itself. Yeah. But there's something to be said about, okay, I've collected these data points. Here's what the data suggests. Perhaps we've got to keep going. But it is about deliberately saying, I'm going to give myself X number of days or hours or X number of applicants, whatever the criteria or the data variable actually is.
It's constraints, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, it comes back to that awareness, that introspection, but then also at some point, you're not going to have perfect information. There is always information asymmetry, right? There's so many potential variables that can impact any decision you make, many of which you would be blind to. So it's just a matter of collecting as much data that can help you make a good enough decision.
Why do you think people think they need that all the information?
Because I
agree with you.
Yeah, human beings are predisposed to wanting to make decisions from a place of certainty. I think you hit on that earlier, where we don't like uncertainty. We don't like not knowing what's on the other side of the fence. And that, I imagine, comes back to biological evolution. Like for that tens of thousands of years, we were hunter-gatherers and we were prey for a lot of predators out there. So we didn't want to step foot into that pond for fear of a crocodile chewing our leg off. Right? And I think a lot of those innate sort of fears of the unknown are still there and prevent us from being the best possible versions of ourselves. But by not taking those decisions,
what have you said to people that have asked you similar questions, right? Because that's what I agree with you. I totally agree with you. Like, we're inclined to not like things we don't know. The unknown scares the hell out of us, right? And whether it's in terms of a social setting, like doing something outside your comfort zone, again, comes back to being part of a tribe and not wanting to be ostracized because that meant death back in the day. The same goes when, you're in your unknown, in a professional landscape, and it's potentially challenging. You don't know when you're going to make cash. If you don't make cash, you don't live, you can't pay your bills, anything like that. But what do you say to people who have asked you similar questions, right?
About jumping into the unknown?
Yeah.
I guess I take a leaf out of Tim Ferriss's book when it comes to this stuff, which is
Which book?
pretty simple. Well, his philosophical views on life book. Effectively, his whole notion of fear setting.
Yeah.
I think he's got a TED talk on the topic, and I often use this as a method to get buy-in from companies that I'm trying to sell to as well, which is what's the worst possible outcome, and are you okay with that? Can we operate within those boundaries? What's the worst possible outcome, and how can you mitigate against that? And how
Like
can
a pre-mortem, right?
a pre-mortem, yeah. And how can you avoid that outcome altogether and still do the thing? Like, by understanding what's the worst possible outcome, am I okay with that? What do I need to do to mitigate that impact? How quickly could I bounce back if the worst possible outcome actually came to be? And if I'm comfortable with the answers to those questions and what that act is going to move me forward if it works out, then definitely go ahead and do it. I think relationships and provide for a good analogy in this space. Like if you're a 20-year-old dude and you see some girl you like and you're scared to ask her out, it's like, well, what's the worst possible thing that can happen? It's like, you feel crappy for half an hour, and then it's like, there's actually so many other potential mates out there. And then if you make friends with that idea and visualize the whole thing happening and getting rejected and then being
The
ready
secret
for it.
style,
Yeah, but then it just becomes a lot. It's an empowering thing because you've worked through the possible outcomes, and you know that, hey, if this does work, then potentially could have a really rewarding relationship with this person, and it's going to take my life up a notch. So I think what holds people back is a failure to really articulate what are the potential outcomes and how might they bounce back from that. Because I think once you do that, then you're like, actually, I'm pretty comfortable with that, and let's give it a crack.
Let's take the flip side of the coin, right? Because we've obviously experienced both sides of entrepreneurship, and as we said before, like we probably lightly touched on it, entrepreneurship does get glamorized a little bit. I wouldn't choose any other life because that's what we're choosing. We're being very intentional with our choices here. But it's hard at the same time, man. Like it's really hard.
It's really hard, yeah.
I also don't like absolutes or superlatives, right? So I'm not going to ask what's the hardest thing about entrepreneurship, but what challenges do you think, what have you had to navigate? What have you found really hard? And I'll share my thoughts as well, and just like anybody else. Because what I'm finding is a lot of people who ask me about this question, it's like, I think it's almost our responsibility to give them both sides of the coin, right? To give them a holistic picture of actually what they're choosing. Because, it's hard. Okay, it's also super rewarding, but Mark Manson talks about this. What sort of pain are you willing to endure? Right? I think it speaks a lot to your purpose or what you're actually inclined to resonate with.
Yeah, that's something I actually wanted to explore on this
Beat you to it.
podcast today. Did beat me to it. It's something that I've been wrestling with for a while, because in order to build something great, something enduring, something that actually matters, you need to put in that sustainable effort day in, day out for a very long time. So managing that psychology, Andreas and Mark Andreessen talks about this when he talks about entrepreneurs, and the number one thing they need to do is learn how to manage their psychology, because you're going to come up against the whole notion of the trough of despair or trough of disillusionment. And in my case, I've made friends with that. Like, I'm so down with the trough today that when
you'd invite it out for coffee, you just want to hang with it on
go to brunch with the
on
trough
a Sunday.
I'd even buy the trough an extra poached egg.
He's a gentleman. Chivalry is not dead.
No, but I feel like if you make friends with that, you're getting an advantage where most of your competitors are at a disadvantage, because that mental strength just means you're going to keep moving forward when other people give up, when they look for excuses, and when they look to rationalize why they've given up their business and pursued something else. Coming back to your point about rationalization. One of the challenges, I think, with entrepreneurship is, as an entrepreneur, and this comes back to biological evolution and the way our brains are wired. Entrepreneurs tend to be, their amygdala is kind of suppressed somewhat, but our frontal cortex is running wild. So we're always intrigued by novelty and trying new things. And so when we start something new, there is the risk of that chemical reaction just flooding our brains, and we're like, this is awesome, and you just put so much energy into something, but then 6 months go by and you've kind of built something that's working, it's making money, but that initial chemical release isn't there anymore. And so you're like, well, that chasing the dragon, how do you maintain that excitement that you had for that idea when you started? Right?
That's interesting. Because obviously, like, our dopamine receptors get desensitized over time.
You get desensitized, and the same applies to relationships. Like, you get desensitized, and that feeling of love is gone.
Yeah.
That feeling, that enthusiasm that you had for your business when you first started out, maybe not as strong as it once was.
Yeah.
So how do you keep moving forward despite that?
Have you reconciled that? Because that's interesting, right? Because it's like, because when you immediately say that, I'm like, okay, well, from a neuroscience perspective, like, if we look at addiction, like, the dopamine receptors get blunted over time.
Yeah.
And so the only way to instigate the same amount of pleasure response is to increase either the frequency of an activity or the intensity of an activity, right? That's why gamblers have to put down, they have to bet more over time, because the same amount doesn't give them the same thrill. That's why whether it's drug addicts have to take bigger hits, whatever it might be, right? So if we're thinking about this idea of, in essence, an addiction or a yearning for that novelty experience at the start, well, if we know the signs, we know that's going to get desensitized over time. So is the solution to that, or have you even figured out the solution to that? And if it is it just about finding more novelty all the time, or finding novelty within the existing novelty?
Yeah, so that's the question. And I think in today's technological sort of landscape, where things are moving quickly, I think it does lend itself to finding that novelty within what you're currently doing more frequently. And therefore, if I look at, Collective Campus, the past 3.5 years, we went from running face-to-face workshops to doing stuff online, to running accelerator programs, to now looking at setting up a distributed autonomous startup accelerator, to working with other startups in the blockchain space, to publishing books and working on podcasts. And it's all kind of self-contained under the one umbrella. But it's an evolution, and I think if you don't have an evolution of what you're doing, and also an evolution of who you are while you're doing what you're doing, and looking for lessons from business and every day, then there is a very big risk that that shot of adrenaline into your veins that you had when you first pursued whatever path you're pursuing subsides, and the dopamine receptors aren't as receptive to the same frequency or the same volume or intensity of dopamine, then you will lose that excitement. And in fact, that is effectively what depression is. It's like when your dopamine receptors just
totally
blunted, completely blunted. And so how are you going to lead a team? How are you going to inspire people? How are you going to bring the energy that you need to make this thing work if you haven't got that thrill? So I guess for me, it's about seeking novelty within what you're doing.
Does that assume that you need that thrill to be able to inspire and lead the team, or is it potentially going past that in the same way that it's a relationship's not just about love and understanding, okay, well, the love's going to fade, but I'm not with somebody just for the love, right? I'm with them because of the alignment of values and compatibility and everything. Right?
So I just scribbled down the word meaning as you were asking that, which comes back full circle to what we've been talking about throughout the entire show. I mean, the underlying current here has been purpose and flow and why. And I think if that is strong enough, then reminding yourself of that in the morning when you journal, reminding yourself of what you're grateful for, the opportunities to work with an awesome team, to create, to get up every day, to work on something that you really believe in. I think that is, it's not going to completely offset the neurochemical sort of realities, but it is going to give you a much better sort of shot at sustaining the work you do for a long time, despite not having the same sort of enthusiasm you might have had on day one as you have on day 1000.
Yeah, I agree with that, man. Like, one of the things that's really helped me through it, like, because again, it's the motivation roller coaster, right? You go up and down, and it's just inevitable. I think it happens for every single person, but it's for me reminding myself that I shouldn't be conflating pleasure or the adrenaline rush
Yeah.
with satisfaction and fulfillment, because I'm looking for the latter, right? I'm not looking for the former. And that's actually what we talked about at the very, very start. It was like this idea of, okay, the instant gratification, the validation, those dopamine hits, whatever it might be. A lot of people are able, not even able, a lot of people are inclined to think that that's actually what they're seeking, right? But that's really a temporary thing. That's totally transient. Yeah. It's never going to be sustainable. But the idea of looking for something that potentially, like, it's again back to process orientation versus goal orientation necessarily, right? Like, it's the idea that what you're looking for, or for me at least, what I'm looking for is moment to moment flow, moment to moment fulfillment. And the only way to create this is to understand I'm doing something that aligns with my values in an overall way.
Yeah. So that moment to moment flow, I mean, to me it sounds like that's something that you're constantly seeking, flow in what you do every day in your work. I know you're quite the autodidact and you're constantly learning new things and pushing the boundaries. And I know you just said that, off air you said that the last 4 months have been a massive learning curve for you in the over-the-counter market. But, I mean, in terms of that, what keeps you going? Now, obviously learning, constantly pushing the boundaries in that space, I think, to me, it becomes clear as day that is kind of like a rocket thruster, just keeping you flying at the moment. Yeah. But in terms of where that rocket is going, I mean, one thing I don't think we've really unpacked today is what is that overarching why? Not necessarily wanting to get into flow, but what are you actually working towards? Like, what difference do you actually want to make in the world? Like, why are you doing what you're doing?
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think it comes actually back to, and it's important I caveat this with my relationship with money as well, right? So we started talking about like my dad's influence on me and things like that. But from a very young age, like dad always used to say like, money will not make you happy. And again, could potentially be construed as cliche.
Dan Carmen, what is it, $75,000 a year?
Yeah. After that, it's diminishing marginal returns, right? Yeah. And at the time, like I'll say it, like at the time I was probably more ego driven, more like driven by the extrinsic expectations and the extrinsic validation. You can get a good job, you get an IB and all these things, right? And so I didn't necessarily resonate with what my dad was saying. Like I heard him, but I didn't quite appreciate it, right?
So would you say your dad's money is a big value of his, or
it's not? It's not.
Sure.
So he was saying that money is not important.
Okay, sure.
He was saying money is not important. He was saying that you can make a lot of money, but it won't make you happy. And so that was always in the nagging in the back of my head. And I think a really important thing for me was understanding, especially getting into entrepreneurship and then creating a profitable business and doing that pretty early on in my career. I got to a place where I was like, okay, now I can understand what it means. Like, able to get to a stage where I'm totally financially independent, all off my own bat. Yeah. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm not really fulfilled from that point. And so I started with that, and I preface it with that because that's really led me to where I am now into understanding my greater mission. So I'm pretty desensitized to the idea of money, whether it's a couple $1 million, whether it's a couple $100 million, whatever it is, right? Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not, I think it would be naive to say that getting to a certain financial position is not going to be more beneficial for your life, but it just changes your lifestyle, right? So if you're looking for a materialistic life, and again, there's layers to that as well. I'm not just saying materialistic life, go out and buy shiny cars and everything like that, but materialistic life in the sense that you seek extrinsic rewards, right? And that gets very, very deep down a rabbit hole. But when you understand that it's bigger than that, because really you can be in a really nice house but still be sad, right? Like Socrates talks about this is the way of it's his kind of litmus test. Like if you can have something and still be sad while having that, then that doesn't make you happy.
Yeah, to quote the philosopher John Bon Jovi, tonight I won't be alone to know that don't mean I'm not lonely.
Yeah, it's so true.
There's no substance.
Absolutely, right? And so that's my relationship with money. Like I'm pretty desensitized to it. And I think money is a byproduct of creating a lot of value in the world. And Naval Ravikant talks about this in terms of creating wealth over being rich, right? And it's essentially just focusing on being able to create value that's not accessible to the rest of the world. And ultimately you get paid for that. But my fascination is around how can I create value? And so I guess an overarching philosophy for me is just appreciating that every single person's always figuring things out, right? Yeah. And I think that kind of gets stigmatized in a bad way, that people are like, oh, I'm figuring it out. I don't really want to say that. But like, again, it's the imposter syndrome. Like once you are in that position where quote unquote other people think you figured it out, or people from around you think, oh, he has everything sorted, like financially independent, whatever, runs his own business, and you understand, okay, well, I still also have things I need to reconcile in my own head. Yeah. And so it's not even levels to it, it's really subjectivity, right? Like meeting a lot of successful authors, met a lot of billionaires, like all these things, right? They all are human, and it's humanizing that process. And for me, where this comes back to the question you're asking is around, okay, what's the bigger purpose? Well, for me, it's like, how do I create value in the world that, and again, I don't want to be too generic, so I'm going to unpack that as well. But like, how do you create value that you can disseminate? And I have a very eclectic interest set, right? Like I like technology, I like learning, and like meta learning skills. I like biology, I like science, I like fitness, I like health. Like I have a very eclectic interest set. So for me, it's like, okay, well, I want to be in a position where I'm able to deploy capital in a lot of different areas and assist other people to make a ton of wealth in the world. Like, not only a ton of wealth, a ton of value in the world, right? Because I'm a big proponent of, you can't change things just by yourself, right? It's collaboration versus competition type thing. Like, the more people that I can empower with the things I've learned, can empower with money, can empower with more resources. Resources, again, could be financial, but also could be in terms of experience and everything like that. The greater my reach and the greater my network, and the more valuable my network is going to be able to become. And so I'm not necessarily trying to pigeonhole a vision of sorts, but all I know for sure is like my North Star is to be able to create an incredible amount of value in the world. And when you reverse engineer that, how do you create a lot of value? Well, you empower a lot of other people to create value. So how do you empower a lot of other people to create value? Well, potentially sometimes it's experience. So I have to go through a whole lot of things and tinker myself and experiment across all these different activities to have those experiences, have those insights. But it's also, you can empower other people with capital as well. And I think that's also where it gets stigmatized. I think some people think the idea of making money is a dirty word, and I think there's probably a just argument for certain areas or certain businesses or certain industries or niches where that it comes from a bad place. But I don't think capital in and of itself, or building wealth, or building an amassment of capital, is necessarily a bad thing. So Chamath Palihapitiya, CEO of Social Capital, actually talks about this as well, and he's like earn like an investment bank, distribute like Robin Hood type thing, right? Like you can amass a whole lot of wealth, and if you are capable of that, and then it comes to how do you amass wealth? You create value that the world can't access very easily, right? If you can amass a lot of wealth and you have that skill set, then you shouldn't shirk away from doing that, and I don't. And the reason for that is because when you're in a position when you can actually get a seat at the table, whether we like it or not, we live in a capitalist economy, right? Money does talk. So we can have humanitarian motivations, we can have these altruistic visions and things we want to actualize and materialize in the world, but without a lot of capital deployed behind it, it's potentially going to be futile, or it's going to be a lot more challenging. So for me, it's like, okay, I know there are particular things that I want to do in the world. I know there are particular missions or purposes that I want to be able to fuel and seed and really accelerate in the world, right? Whether it's in terms of biotech, right? Like specific illnesses that have affected people close to me, things wanting to fund those and fund research into those, make a material difference there. But what I do know is that I myself am not able to do every single thing. Even if I do self-identify as an autodidact and I like learning and I can learn across all these different things, my time's finite, right? So it's how do you deploy that in the most efficient way possible? And it's like really empowering a larger network. So not only surrounding yourself with people that identify with your mission and want to be empathic, they are empathic, they are compassionate, they are very self-driven, they are self-disciplined, all those values that align with who I am and the sort of people I like to surround myself with, finding people who are compatible with that, but also have a specific mission that is probably a lot more narrow focused than I. Yeah. So for me, it's more around breadth. And this is a bit of a paradox, right? Like it's how do you focus on breadth? Like, but that's actually what I'm trying to do with my life. I'm trying to focus on breadth. I'm trying to accumulate an assortment of capital. Like Antihero Capital at the end of the day is a fund, right? Like our purpose is to make capital, and to make returns. But the reason we do that is so we can deploy it in specific projects that are able to make a significant difference in how we're going to move this world forwards, right? Whether it's in blockchain, but there's other projects that interest us. So that for me is the overarching narrative. Really, it's like, how do you focus on breadth? And the way to do that is to focus on a specific skill set that the world doesn't really have, because ultimately that's how you're going to get paid. Like that's where capital comes from. So that is potentially a very, very meta response, but like that for me is the arc of where I'm trying to go.
Right. So I mean, the whole notion of focusing on breadth, like you said, there's a very glaring paradox there.
Yeah.
How do you focus on a lot of different things? But ultimately what you're really focusing on is how to create that capital so that you can invest it then into, say, all these other value creating initiatives, whether it is in biotech or whether it's in blockchain or whatever the case
AI,
may
whatever
be.
it is, right?
Whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think the conventional wisdom is, don't spread yourself thin, focus, and I totally agree with that. And we were talking about Warren Buffett earlier today and how he credits focus as the number one reason for his success, because he doesn't invest in, say, technology that he doesn't understand. Why would you? Why would you back something you don't understand? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, collect the data points. Don't make a decision without the data points. You're not going to pick the magic mystery fruit behind tray number 7. When you've got perfectly good roast chicken and broccoli in the tray next to it, especially if you're on a protein.
Only way to do it.
Only way to do it, definitely. So I mean that underlying sort of desire to want to create that value, though. Yeah. Because as human beings, generally, we tend to focus on ourselves first, and I think that is capitalism. Like, if we want to make the world a better place, it's not just about shaking the tin. It's about what value can I create that I can then redistribute, right? Yeah. That's why I'm a big proponent of social enterprise rather than not-for-profits and charities, 99% of which, arbitrary number, don't serve any real purpose other than to pay the people that work there, right?
Research paper by Steve Glevesky, 99%.
99%, exactly. You know what I mean?
Peer reviewed by me, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, where does that need or desire to want to create that value come from?
Yeah, like, ultimately I think it's probably from how I was raised, to be honest. Like, my parents came over from Vietnam to Australia, didn't have a lot. They worked very hard, and like they were the values that had to be programmed into them. It was like very survival orientated, right? Yeah. They had to work hard. They had no option, right? And how we kind of grew up, it was like I was given every opportunity that I could ever ask for, but I definitely don't forget kind of the origin of my story. To use a superhero analogy, right? Yeah. And so for me, it's like why do I want to create value in the world? Is because I probably came from a place where it didn't have a lot. Right.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, though, because there's a lot of entrepreneurs, and you look at Silicon Valley, more than 50% of the founders there are, Asian,
immigrant background,
from Asia, from China, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, and India predominantly, and there is this sort of value of they value hard work in a way that perhaps a lot of people who are seventh generation American may not, and that's. I'm not going to say everybody who is a seventh generation American doesn't value hard work.
That's also in the research paper.
That's also in the research paper. But the numbers around entrepreneurship don't lie. Yeah. Having said that, though, there are a lot of migrants, many of which I know personally. I mean, my parents came over from what was then Yugoslavia in 1971, Social Democratic Federal Republic at the time, and they effectively fled that world. And even though they had the same sort of hard-working values and valued money and the value that it can actually create in the world, and despite that, there's so many people who tell the same story. Whose parents came over from, say, communist Europe, from Vietnam, whatever the case is, who don't quite see the world the same way. And because they had nothing up until, say, 10, 20 years ago, become way more pronounced in their self-servitude than other people. Yeah. Where it's like, well, I never had anything, so now I'm going to get that flashy car and that big house and I'm going to wear the gold and all that sort of stuff. And you see this play out in lots of sort of social bubbles around the world where communities who perhaps had nothing for centuries suddenly find wealth and then they show it. Like there's no humility there. So I feel like what you're talking about there can work for altruism, but also heavily against it.
Yeah, without a doubt. Like, I can't speak for everybody else, but I think originally when we come back to the extrinsic reasons why I wanted to get into conventional jobs that were well regarded, like managing consulting or investment banking, was probably from a place of overcompensation, right? Like
overcompensating for that lack of wealth.
Yeah, not having that growing up, right? Not having that growing up. I went to the people I was around from a very young age were quite wealthy families and everything like that, and it was probably something deep in the recess of my psyche, right, or my subconscious, where it was like, okay, like a point to prove, right? And I think that is hardwired, and a lot of entrepreneurs from ethnic backgrounds have spoken pretty openly about that being their initial motivation, overcompensating for not having that. And like ultimately, that's why I worked hard. But I think about it from the perspective of my parents as well. Like they worked hard from a survival point of view, but like if you literally strip it back, like they worked hard because they didn't have anything, because they needed to get something, right? And so psychologically, I thought I didn't have anything, even though I will preface it with like I was given opportunities, right? But growing up, like psychologically, in comparison, and this is where like relative subjectivity comes into it. In comparison, I thought, well, okay, compared to my peers at the time, like I didn't have as much as they did. Like I went to a very pronounced school, and again, it was very wealthy families and very wealthy friends, but I didn't come from the kind of same upbringing, right? So that really led me down the path where I was like, okay, probably now reflecting on it, came from a place of overcompensation where it's like, okay, I didn't have that growing up. I wanted to essentially to validate myself because they were the benchmarks which people were, and still people are still measured to now. That's why I got into it, right? But when I got into it, I was able to understand, okay, that's pretty unfulfilling. And so when it comes back to, okay, what's the overarching reason that I want to create value, is because I understand that in and of itself, money doesn't do anything for me. It's like, other than being a vehicle for change and being a vehicle to live a certain lifestyle, money from a fulfillment, satisfaction point of view doesn't do anything for me. And so why do I want to create wealth as a way to create value? Because I know that just creating riches, I guess the distinction, potentially semantic distinction between wealth and riches is important there. Like riches is just making a lot of money. Wealth, it could extend beyond and transcend beyond just finances, right? Why I want to create a lot of wealth in my life, and why I want to create abundance, and why I want to create value through all these other different means is because I know that just the money itself doesn't do anything for me. Like I'm totally desensitized to it. And potentially in some ways, I think I was probably gifted to be able to grow up around people who were very wealthy, because I was able to experience those kind of lifestyles from an early age that I still felt like an outcast. I still felt disenfranchised by the people I was around. I talked about this at a TEDx open mic the other day, but it was like around this idea of the intimacy vacuum. And there's this concept that we can be around a whole lot of people but still feel lonely, right? And so that was something I grappled with and had to reconcile in a big way growing up, was this idea that I could be around a whole lot of people but not really connect with the people I was around, right? So have surface level superficiality. Yeah, you were about to say something.
Yeah. So just as you said that, it kind of prompted a thought, and I think we've discussed this previously around friendship groups, whereby we grow up with certain friends. We go to primary school, high school, maybe university as well, and there seems to be this sort of expectation that friends forever. That once a friend, always a friend, and that you stick by them through thick and thin. But as we've explored on this particular show, it's all about constant tinkering and experimentation and adaptation and evolution of ourselves over time. And what can happen is, if you are of that particular mindset, if you are predisposed to that tinkering and evolving, then who you are today is going to be vastly different to who you were, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And unless your friends at the time have also gone on that journey, then the distance between you and them in terms of that core beliefs, those core beliefs, that value set, is going to be very, very wide. So those relationships, while they are there, they may not fill you anymore the way they may have, say, when you were in high school, when you were classmates. And there is that intimacy vacuum because while there's still a lot of people around you, perhaps the substance isn't there. And the value that you're deriving isn't where you want it to be. And at the same time, you're not creating the value that they want because the stuff that they're potentially interested in doesn't align with what you're interested in.
Yeah, this is something, again, I think is an ongoing thing I think about because it's particularly pertinent in the stages I'm at in my life, but it's also, I think it's a lot of people can relate to it. It's this idea of, it is relationships, right? And we're not just talking romantic relationships. It can be friends, it can be family, anything. But it's, how do you straddle the line between having a friendship or a relationship over a long period of time when inevitably the only constant is change, right? When you will continually evolve and you will continually adapt, and how does that influence the sort of people you want to surround yourself with? And so one thing I've thought about in a big way is this idea of coexistence rather than codependence. And I think it's toxic in a relationship, specifically, again, friendship or romantic, where you're codependent on each other, when you absolutely can't live without the other person. I think it puts you in a position where you become too comfortable, right? Like you forget the importance of independence. You forget the importance of self-clarity, the importance of focusing on what really motivates you. And you conflate your motivations with their motivations and you become one. And I think why that is dangerous is because not only if you potentially break up, but as you grow in different directions, like you need to understand what your path is, what your authentic mission is, what your calling is, whatever you want to call it. And so why it becomes around coexistence is I visualize it in some ways of kind of like a footpath, like we're all walking along our own path. Yeah. When our paths align and you can share a part of your life with somebody because you're walking in the same direction, then that's phenomenal. But at the end of the day, we all walk in our own shoes, meaning that our paths will inevitably go in their own direction. If that direction happens to align with somebody for a period of time, then that's fantastic. But it's not necessarily something we force.
So is there something to be said about this whole notion of, and we've talked about this from the perspective of, say, a significant other, where it's a cheerleader versus a fullback, whereby you might have someone who just supports you on your path versus someone who is, a co-star. When it comes to our friendship circles, I mean, if we take the biological or an evolutionary sort of lens on things, for tens of thousands of years, we worked in tribes and we would derive everything we needed from the people within that tribe. But now, when it comes to, say, relationships with a significant other, there is this expectation that they will give us all of our, fulfill all of our needs, emotional, physical, etc. And when it comes to our friendship groups, it's like, well, I want to be able to discuss everything with this person. But perhaps that's not realistic. And to quote the cheesy Tony Robbins, replace expectation with appreciation. But perhaps when you do, rather than just saying, okay, I've evolved, I'm this different person now, and therefore I'm not going to be friends with this person anymore because they don't fill me anymore with what I need. Right? But maybe it's a case of, well, what do we still have in common? And perhaps just seeking that from that particular person, and not always expecting that this person is going to give you everything you need. Or is it a matter of, like what you've said there, well, we were on the same path up until a certain point, but now we've gone our separate ways. Is that a balance of the two?
I think it's about priorities, right? Like when you drift away from certain friends or relationships or anything like that, right? Like ultimately it's for a reason. And so it's because they don't align or they're not compatible on what you would think is one of your high priorities, right? Potentially it could be something you're really interested in, or the line of work you do, right? Potentially people have work friends, right? So they're not friends with people when they no longer work together because they were aligned on their path because they were pursuing the same mission there. But in terms of should you still fraternize or still hang out with your friends, that don't fit all those tick all those boxes.
Yeah.
I think it's just at the end of the day understanding like why you did hang out with those friends. Was it a friendship out of convenience? Was it a friendship because you would see them at the water cooler every day?
Yeah.
Is it a friendship because you would play sport with them every day? Like, is that what the friendship was about, or was it around a compatibility of values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's around a compatibility of values, and those values are ultimately something you still hold very close to your chest and you still prioritize, it doesn't matter what they're doing. And that, like, for me, that's the real difference. Like, the what doesn't mean so much. It's really, it's the who and the why, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who you are, if you're still compatible, then they can still be your friends. Like, that's what I mean. Like, if they don't like a specific sport, right? Like, if you hung out with them and you went to the football with them all the time, and then you no longer have the time to go to football, are you still going to hang out with them? If the answer is no, then potentially that friendship was really predicated really only on that commonality of liking football, right? But if you went to the football with them, but they also shared the same appreciation for family values, or the same appreciation for improving yourself, and again, you don't necessarily have to improve yourself in the exact same domains, it's the values behind that or the reason why you're pushing yourself, then it still makes total sense to still hang out with them even if you don't see them every day. And that's kind of the distinction I make.
So this comes back to as core sort of beliefs, like core values. For example, I value emotional awareness, and I value self-development, and I value curiosity, and things of that sort. And you know, rather than focusing on the what, it's about that why, right?
100%.
And if that is aligned with that person, then regardless of
what they're doing,
they spend their 9 to 5 or whatever the case is, you can still have a meaningful relationship. That's
what I think. That's what I think. It's specific to friendships. I think it becomes slightly more complex when you're talking about relationships. Mm-hmm. Because when your paths deviate, it's like, so I would probably I do identify as a monogamist. Mm-hmm. And so I would be in a relationship with somebody and only that person. And so then it's understanding, like, even though you coexist, you want to ultimately be building a life with somebody and moving in a similar direction to them. You're not always going to have the exact overlap because we're all going to change, but as long as we share the same, I guess, compass, if you will, and we're heading in a similar direction. And so I talked about this with a friend recently, but it's like dating somebody for their process rather than what they do or anything superficial in that nature, because give or take, even though everything is to an extent malleable, process, I like to believe, is reasonably consistent. Like, your process or your values or the reasons why you do things are going to be reasonably consistent. It's not to necessarily say they're 100% going to be locked in stone, but they're going to follow a similar vector, right? And so that's the sort of coexistence that I think I'm looking for in terms of a partner.
Right. So when you talk about process, you're talking about the way they go about making decisions?
More in terms of, I should probably unpack that. So there's a big movement around process orientation versus outcome orientation, and process orientation is more how they go about, whether it's how they go about making decisions, how they go about achieving certain outcomes rather than the actual outcome that they achieve. So that's what I more mean. So in terms of how that fits in and what does somebody's process really look like, we've probably talked about it a fair bit today, but it does go back to their values, right? Are they intellectually humble? And if they make a mistake, and this is going to be part of their process, if they make a mistake, are they going to retreat to deflection? And are they going to suppress their ego and say, okay, they're going to blame it on something else? Or are they going to lean in towards the pain or lean in towards the psychological discomfort and say, okay, I didn't achieve this because of XYZ. I didn't achieve this because I'm not quite at the stage yet that I'm capable of, or I made a mistake, or they're able to accept that. That's what I mean by process.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of relationships, in terms of team members. You've got to have that values alignment, because if I am all based on, if my decisions are based on embracing discomfort, making friends with failure, and then I am, say, for example, dating someone who at the first sign of difficulty gives up and starts rationalizing as to why they shouldn't pursue this thing they want to do but are just scared of having their ego compromised, then that is going to be a very challenging, exhausting relationship to be a part of.
It's incompatible, right?
It's totally incompatible. Similarly, within a team context, if I look at some of the values of our team at Collective Campus, it's things like extreme ownership, experimentation, radical transparency, emotional awareness. And if we have a team member who loves making excuses, wants to make things perfect before they get out of the building, never, is totally emotionally unaware and reactive, and the slightest bit of negative feedback or constructive criticism, they just become a miserable person for the rest of the week, then obviously that relationship isn't going to work. And there's no, in that case, you're better off just saying, look, I think you're better working for another organisation, because it's better for them, it's better for us.
That's it.
But and being really clear about what those values are, and ensuring that alignment is absolutely key with any relationship.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good, man. Well, look, we are running up to the 2-hour mark. I think this has to be the longest episode of Future Squared today. So
the epitome of flow right here for the last 2 hours.
We've broken a record here on Future Squared today. But before we wrap up, I guess I should probably ask you the 3 questions I ask all of my guests in our lightning round.
All right, let's do it.
Let's do it. I'm assuming after 1 hour and 56 minutes that you're ready, so I'm not even going to ask that question. Question number 1. If you could work for any organisation at any stage of the company life cycle, who would it be, at what stage, and why?
I would choose Social Capital by Chamath Palihapitiya, and I would choose it when they were just first starting. So the reason there is Chamath has a very, very unique outlook and unique lens that he sees the world through. So not only is he very aligned in terms of wanting to deploy capital for altruistic reasons and wanting to make material change in terms of the world, focusing on social change, that's ultimately the sorts of projects he deploys into, but also the way he thinks about problems, his decision-making process, he's very rationally orientated and very logical in terms of how he unpacks things, and he divorces himself from emotions, and I think he maintains a very admirable level of emotional equilibrium when he makes decisions, right? Social capital.
Fantastic. And I think working for an organisation where, again, you're aligned with the way that founder thinks and their process, obviously it makes for a much better work experience, one where you will find that fulfillment, right? So beautifully ties into what we just wrapped up discussing a few moments ago. Question number 2 is, if you could ask anyone a question dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
I would talk to Michael Jordan, and I would ask...
Michael B. Jordan.
No.
Just clarify.
Yeah, I would talk to the all-time GOAT. Debatable.
Yes. Well, debatable. I tend to agree. I mean, 6.
I'm a LeBron fan. Let's put it out there. LeBron, if you're listening to this, I love you.
6 NBA rings, 5 MVPs.
Yeah.
You can't beat that.
He's phenomenal for what he's done for the sport, but I would ask him why he got into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, because his dad actually wanted him to play baseball. Yeah,
and he dabbled in it.
Dabbled after his dad was, gunned down, and he went off and tried to honour his dad's memory by playing for the Chicago White Sox, and then he was on loan to some minor league teams. But why did he initially go against his dad's wishes and pursue basketball? I'm not sure if he's covered that. I did read his biography a few years ago, but I don't think they particularly unpacked why he pursued basketball instead of baseball at the time. But very good. And lucky last. And we've kind of explored a few of them today. We've touched on the fact that you like to journal, quite self-aware and introspective. You mentioned fitness briefly, but what particular sort of daily rituals or routines do you have to help you get into flow, to help you work towards your mission of creating value and building up that capital that you can then redistribute to empower other people around the world to create that value and have that breadth of impact that you're looking to make?
Yeah. So I'm an early riser, similar to yourself.
Yes.
I wake up at around 4 o'clock normally. So straight away, I head to the gym on a fasted stomach, so I don't eat before I train.
Yep.
And I train calisthenics, so gymnastics work, a lot of body weight stuff. The reason I do that, and it's part of my structure, is that it allows me to enter a state of flow very, very early. Gymnastics is a high consequence sport or training activity, right? Like if you're hanging mid in the air and trying to defy gravity and you're not focusing, you can really hurt yourself if you fall off, right? So immediately I have to concentrate from the start of the day, right? And it puts me in a situation where I have to remind myself of all my values, right? And I love training and I love physical exercise and health because I think it's a microcosm for the rest of life, right? How you train, how you do anything is how you do everything, right? So how you train, you have to make sure you have intensity, you have to be in flow, you have to be humble. Like gymnastics is not something that you can essentially bullshit your way around, right? You can't say you can do a certain skill, then try it and fall flat on your face and say, oh no, I can do it. It's like the proof's in the pudding. So I do that at the very start of my day. And then I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm listening to podcasts wherever I'm driving anywhere. And I make sure that at the end of every single day, I journal. And the reason I journal, and we were talking about this before, the reason I journal is to unpack thoughts I had from the day, things I'm still trying to reconcile. So my actual approach to journaling is, okay, what have I learned today? And how this fits into a daily routine and why I want to maintain this consistency is because ultimately I have to keep myself accountable because nobody else cares as much around your progress or your mission as you do. So I have to keep myself accountable. So I journal at the end of every single day to make sure if I'm aligned on my values, right? So I'm asking myself, what did I learn today? And if I didn't, if I was grappling with something, if I had blockage for a certain reason, I make sure that I'm totally raw, totally unencumbered, and very, very honest with myself about the reasons why. Because at the end of my journal, I don't try to tie everything up because I think when you try to look for that endpoint or when you try to look for that certitude, you're forcing something, right? So really for me, journaling is all around just being totally non-filtered and just being honest with somebody at least, right? Which is myself. And so I will finish my day every single day before I head to bed with that. In terms of the rest of the routines, my phone goes off, no notifications, no blue light. Very pedantic with my sleep. Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker is a great book if anybody hasn't read that. But I'm very pedantic with my sleep because I need to optimize my body because how you do anything, is how you do everything.
Always make your bed in the morning, I assume.
That's it. Yeah.
Fantastic. If our listeners want to learn a little bit more about yourself, where can they go to learn more and connect?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn, James Nguyen. Search James Nguyen Anti-Hero Capital. If you just Google Anti-Hero Capital, I'll be there as well. And I also contribute for Forbes as well. So just Google Forbes, James Nguyen, and you'll find me as well.
Fantastic. We'll add all of those links to the show notes for our listeners. Thanks again for making the time, my man. I'm sure our listeners will have enjoyed this conversation and hopefully they'll find a little bit more introspectivity, if I can even call that a word, in their own lives.
Thanks, David. This has been a pleasure.
Cheers, man.
All right, man.
Future
Peace.
Squared is up.